get started. I don't know where everybody else is. I suppose they'll turn up as time goes by. I do apologize for getting started late, but now let's pick up in 2 Kings chapter 13, and then we'll look over to 2 Chronicles chapter 24 in just a moment. But in 2 Kings chapter 13, we're introduced to the son of Jehu. Now you may recall that Jehu was the king who was anointed, who was designated by God to wipe out Ahab's lineage. Ahab, of course, had followed after Jeroboam and Baasha and some of the others, and had provoked the Lord even more profoundly than any of them up to that point. And so after Ahab's son, Ahaziah, I got the wrong name there, I apologize. Ahaziah, yeah, I did have the right name. After Ahab's son Ahaziah is taken out of the way, then Jehu becomes the next king in Israel. And this is during the time that Athaliah, the woman, was queen in Judah temporarily for 6 years. Now, after she is deposed and removed, we have Ahaziah, the king of Judah. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Good evening, Miss Mary. Sorry to get started late. It's one of those moments where it's a little bit confusing because we have two kings, same name. And you pick up in chapter 13, then, the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah. Now we have Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, who begins to reign in Samaria, reign over Israel in Samaria. He's going to last longer than some, 17 years, but he is cut from the same bolt of cloth. You notice right off the bat, he worships the golden calves. He's indulging, he is enmeshed in false worship. It's interesting to think about the varieties of false worship that take place in Israel, because, of course, in Ahab's day, what did we see? Imported idolatry, the idolatry of the Canaanites, the worship of Baalim and Asherah. But what did Jeroboam the first establish in the first place? The worship of golden calves. Well, there's a precedent for that going back not just to Mount Sinai, but back to Egyptian bondage days, where the Egyptians also worshiped cattle. But the thing that Jeroboam does that is just astounding is he credits those idols with mighty works that God had done in bringing Israel out of Egypt. And so you would have to wonder, on some level, is this not even more, in some ways, is this not even more offensive to God than Ahab's indulgence in the idolatry of the Canaanites? Because they at least were not being credited with the mighty works and the good things that God had done in bringing the people out of Egypt. And here, Jeroboam had assigned credit for God's works to a false god, to a false deity. Well, Jehoahaz is enmeshed in that particular variety of fraudulent worship. And so you pick up here in chapter 13, look down to verses 3, 4, and 5, and we have this interesting little assortment of experiences here. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them continually into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. So, what does God do by way of shall we say, compensating them or paying them back for their idolatry? Well, they go into servitude. They are made into tribute or subject, a vassal kingdom of the Syrians, and they serve through two kings, Hazael and then Ben-Hadad. And look at the response. It's a fascinating little miniature of the events of the book of Judges. If you'll remember, in the book of Judges, you have a cycle of events that repeats about 10 times over roughly 350, 400 years, where the people of Israel are very faithful to God, very committed, very dedicated. And then they begin to play the harlot. They begin to dilly-dally, play with idolatry, and become corrupted and indulge in sin and ungodliness. And then God allows some neighboring country to oppress them and put them to tribute and cause them problems and tighten the screws on them until finally they start to wake up and cry out to God for deliverance. And he raises up a judge and delivers them. And then the land has peace, usually just through the lifetime of that judge. And then the cycle starts all over again. Faithful, and then starting away, and then apostate, and then oppressed, and then suffering, and then crying out to God and repenting again. Well, look here in verses 4 and 5. Then, after they've been sold into the hand of the Syrians, then Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Syria oppressed them. Therefore, the Lord gave Israel a savior, so that they escaped from the hand of the Syrians, and they lived in their homes as formerly. So you have this cycle of servitude and sorrow and supplication and salvation. And then what happens? Come down here to verse 6. Nevertheless, they did not depart from the sins of the house of Jeroboam. For all of that, Jehoahaz cries out to the real God, and God blesses them. And how does he respond, or how does he repay God? Well, he's going to continue to be unfaithful. And it's very much like the period of the Judges, except that it's compacted into one generation instead of spread out over 2 or 3. Now, it's interesting to look at verse 5. God appointed them a savior, but he doesn't name him here. Skip down to verse 25, to the last verse of the chapter, and notice, well, look at verses 24 and 25. When Hazael, king of Syria, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities that he had taken from Jehoahaz his father in war. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. So how is it that God saved them? Well, God raised up his son. That is the son of Jehoahaz. Now, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, does this mighty thing, but they still did not repent. Now, look over to chapter 14 for just a moment. We're going to jump ahead for just a second here. Chapter 14, if you look at verses 25 and 27, down here at verse 25, we have Jeroboam the second. He reigns in Israel. And so at verse 25, we read about him. He restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath-Hepher. And then you get down to verse 27. The Lord had not said that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, so he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. So what does God do? In spite of their idolatry, he preserves them. He takes care of them. He uses the son and the grandson of Jehoahaz to accomplish this. Now, what's the common thread in all 3 of those generations? You have Jehoahaz that actually backs up and calls out to the real God for deliverance. But even he basically hedges his bets and continues in the idol worship of those calves. His son and his grandson are unrighteous men. But it's those men that God uses to deliver Israel. And why would he deliver Israel? Not because of their goodness, but for his name's sake, because he had promised not to blot them out permanently. You look down here at verse 6, they continued in false worship. At verse 7, There was not left to Jehoahaz an army of more than 50,000 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen. The king of Syria had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. So Ben-Hazael and then Ben-Hadad had basically taken away Israel's ability to have a standing army, taken away their weapons, their equipment, and so forth, and leaves them with just a comparatively small army. During that time, though, Jehoahaz backs off of his idolatry, and that's how it is that God then begins to back off of his judgment against them and be a little more lenient with them. You look at verses 8 and 9, now you have the record of the death of Jehoahaz, the rest of his acts, all that he did. They're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And he slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. And Joash, his son, reigned in his place. So here's an uncommon end for a king of Israel, the northern kingdom. He seems to have died more or less peacefully. A lot of the kings in Israel wind up being assassinated. But in this case, this man, he's not a perfect man. He's not a good man. But he's not as bad as many of those who went before. So now we have two kings named Joash on the thrones in Israel and Judah at the same time. The 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Joash or Jehoash, same name for both of them. Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 16 years. Well, what do we find out about him? Sorry guy. He was evil. Now, Joash or Jehoash of Judah in Jerusalem, he's not going to last much longer. He's already been on the throne for 37 years. He's going to reign 40 some odd, and then he's out of the way. So he's pretty well done at this point. But what do we learn about him? He's going to, this Joash in Samaria, the northern kingdom, is going to wind up fighting against Amaziah in Jerusalem, Amaziah of Judah. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He walked in those sins. And here in 2 Kings, basically, this is all that we have about him at this point. The rest of his acts, all that he did, the might with which he fought against Amaziah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? He slept with his fathers. Jeroboam sat on his throne. So here's a very unusual circumstance where you have two kings in a row in Samaria who basically die peacefully and are succeeded by their sons. Who in their right mind would name a child Jeroboam? Well, somebody who does not honor God. You think about it, in Israel, nobody in Judah would likely ever name a child Jeroboam just because of the connotation of that name. Jeroboam, who taught Israel to sin. Jeroboam, who established idolatry. Jeroboam, who led Israel into this. But in Israel, in the northern kingdom, given that they're worshiping those gods, that's not, in this time, that's not a name associated with something evil. It's a name associated with the founder of their religion. And so you've got a second Jeroboam here who rules in Israel. And this corresponds to the time of Amaziah's reign in Israel. Amaziah is going to reign for 29 years. Amaziah and Judah. You're right. And Jeroboam, on the other hand, amazingly enough, is going to reign 41 years. It's just astonishing that a man could last that long in Samaria, in Israel. Now, as we go chronologically through here, we have a an aside that takes us to the death of Elisha. But before we get there, flip over to 2 Chronicles for just a moment, to 2 Chronicles chapter 24, and want to pick up one little thing before we get to the death of Elisha. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, we start with Joash in Jerusalem, 7 years old when he began to reign, and he restores the house of the Lord, and all of this is good. And then we find Jehoiada, the priest who has guided him, dies at 130 years old in verse 15. And after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah come and they honor the king. And what's the impact of their influence? Now, the king who has been so good, who has done so much, now begins to participate with them, perhaps even lead them in idolatry. And wrath came upon Judah for the guilt of theirs, and yet God sent prophets, and these testified, but they would not pay attention. And you have Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, who is the priest. Well, Zechariah takes his father's place down here at verse 20. And notice what happens here. He stood above the people and said, "Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he's forsaken you." Now, there are a couple of points to bear in mind, and I think we touched on this last week just as we were ending. Number one, what does he say? You're not prospering. Why not? Because you're not walking with God. You're breaking the Lord's commandments. You jump down to the post-exile days to Malachi, and Malachi is going to deal with the descendants of these people who have come back from captivity. They've been established in the land again for 100 and some odd years at that point, and they're not prospering. And what does Malachi say? Your problem is that you work enslaved to make a little money, and when you do, you put it in a bag full of holes because you're not paying attention to God. Well, that's their ancestors had done the same thing. But then he goes on and says, you have forsaken the Lord, so he has forsaken you. And I think we ended up last time talking about Jesus' words to the disciples in Matthew chapter 10, where he says, look, in verses 32 and 33, if you confess me before men, if you own me, if you claim me, I'll claim you before the Father. But if you don't claim me, if you don't want to associate with me, I'm not going to claim you. It works both ways. Well, that's what's going on here. But look what happens to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest. They conspired against him, and by command of the king, they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown to him, but killed his son. And when he was dying, he said, may the Lord see and avenge. That's an interesting twist on this scenario, because we look at the example of Jesus, and as Jesus is on the cross, what is his prayer? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand. Jump over to the book of Acts to the end of chapter 7, and Stephen, having preached and spoken, and through most of his sermon, the rulers of the Jews, the scribes, the Pharisees that are hearing him must have been saying, amen, amen, that's right, because what's he doing in most of the sermon? He's rehearsing, he's repeating the history of their people. And then he gets down to the point where he's talking about Jesus, and he says, all right, you're just like your ancestors, you're hard of heart, you're unwilling to listen, you've always resisted the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, and now, oh, they're mad. And they grind their teeth and they pick up stones and they stone him. And as he's being stoned, what is Stephen's prayer? Lord, don't lay this sin against them. Lay not this sin to their charge. So you have one very pronounced perspective there in the New Testament, but over here in this circumstance where Zechariah is being very unjustly murdered, and by order of the king, whose father, this man's father had faithfully served and guided that king. So he says, Lord, see and remember. Yeah, he's but we have to remember too that the circumstances overall are somewhat different. These people were actively rejecting, knowing what they were rejecting. And in the case of Jesus on the cross and even Stephen being stoned, those who were rejecting, they didn't even understand what they were doing. Think about what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, if memory serves me, about the rulers who were responsible for crucifying Jesus. Had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Had they realized, had they understood the implications of who he is and what they were doing, they wouldn't have done it. So come back over here to 2 Kings chapter 13. Let's talk about the death of Elisha for a moment. Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die. And notice who goes to see him. Joash, the king of Israel, went down and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And this is where we had talked about this just a little bit last week. He has Joash take a bow and arrows, and you draw your bow and open the window and shoot eastward, and then take these arrows and strike. And he quit beating the ground before he should have. You should have struck 5 or 6 times. You would have struck down Syria, but now you'll strike down Syria only 3 times. Now that's significant because during his reign, what has happened in Syria? We've moved from Hazael as king of Syria, who was anointed by Elijah, to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria. And Ben-Hadad is going to cause all kinds of trouble later on, not just for Israel, but even for Judah as well. So Elisha died, they buried him. Bands of Moabites used to invade the lands in the spring, and as a man was being buried, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And as soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. So you have this circumstance where his bones are interred not in a hole in the ground as we would think of a grave, but think of it as more like a mausoleum or a burial vault. A burial place with a stone either over the top of it or more likely in front of it, much like where Jesus would be buried in Joseph's tomb, which is a cave cut out or hewn out of the stone with a rock to roll in front of it to close it up again. They would typically bury in a mausoleum like that, and then once the soft tissue was all decayed, then when the space was needed, they would remove the bones and put those in a box and bury the box, or set it farther back if there was room in the mausoleum. So here we have the bones of Elisha in a tomb, in a burial place, and in haste, the body of this individual is thrown in. God is God of the living and of the dead. And here we have a miracle where we think we would have looked at this and seen no life at all. And this basically functions as a one last testimony, if you will, to the legitimacy, the power, the authenticity of Elisha and his message, his word. Now notice the summary here at the end of chapter 13. Hazael oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, but the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them, and turned toward them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, nor has he cast them from his presence until now. When Hazael, king of Syria, died, Ben-Hadad became king. Then Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, took again, and this is where we left off a moment ago. We see things turning around. He would not yet destroy them from his presence. He would not yet cast them out. At the time that this is written, that had not yet taken place. But as we're going along, we're going to find things will change. So in chapter 14, then, we have Amaziah becoming king in Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, king of Judea or Judah, and after Jehoahaz, we have Jeroboam II. Now, what do we know about Amaziah? Well, the gist of his circumstances is he's a good king. You look at chapter 14, verse 3. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. It's not up to David's standard, but he did in all things as Joash, his father, had done. He's pretty good. Worship in the high places, and this would seem to be worship of God, not idol worship. Worship in the high places is still allowed. If you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 25 for just a moment and look at verses 2, 3, 4, and 5, you have a parallel there. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not with a whole heart. As soon as the royal power was firmly his, he killed his servants who had struck down the king his father, but he did not put their children to death according to what's written in the law in the book of Moses. And we talked about that last time, how that the fathers don't bear the iniquity of the son, and so forth. So Amaziah and Uzziah in Judah, along with Jeroboam II in Israel, and we are introduced here to war between Judah and Israel in verses 8 through 14. Amaziah sent messengers, come, let us look one another in the face. And notice how the king of Israel responds: a thistle on Lebanon sent to a cedar on Lebanon. He's saying, you're a nobody compared to me. I have 10 tribes, you have 1 tribe. I'm far more powerful and important than you. And you've struck down Edom. Better quit while you're ahead, is the gist of what he has to say here. And this is all about pride and revenge. Now, look over at 2 Chronicles again for just a moment, to chapter 25. And in verses 5 through 13, you have the setting for the matter of revenge. Amaziah assembled the men of Judah, set them by their fathers' houses, mustered 300,000 choice men, 100,000 mighty men of valor that he hired, mercenaries, for 100 talents of silver. He hired them from Israel, and this is where they go and overwhelm some of their enemies. But now the arrogance comes in, the pride comes in down here at verse 14. Amaziah had discharged the army from Ephraim to go home again, and they're not pleased. So you get down here to verse 14. Amaziah came from striking down the Edomites, and he brought the gods of the men of Seir and set them up as his gods and worshiped them and made offerings to them. Dumb as a post now. Why have you sought the gods of a people who did not deliver their own people from your hand? And the king said to him, this is the Lord's prophet asking this. Who made you a royal counselor? Why should you be struck down? Stop, quit while you're ahead so I don't kill you. The prophet stopped but said, I know that God is determined to destroy you because you've done this and not listened to my counsel. So that sets the backstory for this little encounter here, where Amaziah and Jehoash have this set to in chapter 14 of 2 Kings. Amaziah would not listen. He is determined to fight. and it's not going to go well for him. You look down here to verses 13 and 14, and what's the outcome of his conflict? Part of Jerusalem is damaged. The wall, the fortification is torn down in verses 13 and 14. And at this point, now Jehoash, ruler in Samaria, Jehoash dies. How he fought, the rest of his acts, how he fought with Amaziah, king of Judah, slept with his fathers, buried in Samaria, with the kings of Israel. Jeroboam reigns in his place. And so now we get another, this is a comparatively peaceful time in a sense, at least for the kings of Israel. They've gone from the extraordinary evil of Ahab and Jezebel to they're still evil. God does not approve of them, but they're not provoking him as severely as some of their predecessors. So Jehoash dies, Jeroboam begins to reign, and the very next thing we read is that he lived 15 years. Amaziah lived 15 years after Jehoash died, and now he dies. His acts are in the Chronicles of the kings of Judah, and he's murdered. They made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem. He fled to Lachish. They sent after him in Lachish, put him to death, brought him on horses, buried him in Jerusalem, and they took Azariah, 16 years old, and made him king in his place. Well, now, why did they murder Amaziah? There's not an explicit explanation given. But we look at the arc of his life. He was born to a righteous king who then turned sour. He should have reversed the course that his father pursued. And instead, he pursued the evil course of his father. He led his nation in one victory over the Edomites by hiring 100,000 mercenaries, and then loses in conflict with the Israelites. So he has not done the nation well. And that may very well explain why they assassinated him. So Azariah becomes king, 16 years old, and Azariah, also known as Uzziah. Azariah means in Jehovah, or in the Lord is help, and Uzziah means whose strength is Jehovah, or whose strength is the Lord. Azariah secures victories over Edom. He accomplishes good things. In the meantime, Jeroboam II, reigning in Samaria, is an evil, unrighteous man. But you look at chapter 14, for 2 Kings chapter 14, and one of the things you notice about him is that even though he's an evil, unrighteous man, he's also a very strong king. He was able to throw off a lot of the oversight and control of the Syrians over Israel. So it's an interesting political dynamic in a way. You have Judah under Amaziah having some victories over the Edomites. Edomites, of course, are descendants of Esau. They're kinfolks by blood to the Israelites and to the people of Judah, but they are historic enemies and constant problems. So you see Amaziah having some success over them, but then failing in dealing with the Israelites. But in the meantime, who's on the north side of the Israelites with their thumb on the scale against them? The Syrians. So it's just almost like most powerful and less powerful and thinks they're powerful, and we whoop them. As you look at the scale of things from Samaria down to the Edomites. And so Ahaziah, or Azariah rather, in Judah is a good man. But Jeroboam the second now in Samaria, even though he's a strong king, he's an evil king. You look at verses 26 and 27, God prospers him only because he's not yet ready to lower the boom on the northern kingdom. Look at chapter 14, verse 28. You have the summary of Jeroboam II, the rest of his acts, all that he did, his might, how he fought, how he restored Damascus and Hamath to Judah in Israel. Are they not written in the book of the Kings? And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, and Zechariah, his son, reigned in his place. So we have 3 kings in a row in Israel that basically they've died peacefully. And that's very unusual. You have 4 in a row that are an established dynasty. That's the longest so far among those people. Well, that ought to be an indicator, given what God had said about them. This is not going to last much longer. And it doesn't. So you have Azariah now, or Uzziah in the south, and Zechariah in the north. And what's Azariah's fault? Well, he left the high places, just like his ancestors had done. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places. And Azariah is a leper. The Lord touched the king so that he was a leper to the day of his death. Lived in a separate house. And Jotham, his son, has to reign in his place. You have a co-regency here. The interesting thing about Azariah is, how long does he reign? The acts of Azariah, all that he did, written in the book of the Chronicles of Kings of Judah, slept with his fathers, they buried him with his fathers. Doesn't say here, but you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and 27, and guess what? Azariah, or Uzziah, lives a long, long time. He actually lives 52 years. So he has the record at this point for the longest reign in either kingdom. And yet, we don't know how much of that reign, but a good part of it he was not able to actually administer because he's a leper, he's unclean. So, Jotham is the functional ruler, and that leads us then to the circumstances where we're coming to a parting of the ways. We're about to encounter the final kings of Israel. And the last 6 kings of Israel begin with Zechariah. Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam II. So you look at chapter 15 in 2 Kings and pick up down here at verse 8. This is in the 38th year of Azariah. So he's been on the throne a long time, but he's nowhere near done yet. Zechariah reigns over Israel and Samaria for 6 months. He's evil, just like his fathers, did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. And Shallum, the son of Jabesh, conspired against him, struck him down at Ibleam, put him to death, and reigned in his place. So we go from basically long, stable reigns, 16, 17, 20 years, thereabouts, 6 months. He's evil, and think of it as him being executed. The prophecy is fulfilled to Jehu. Go back to chapter 10 and verse 30 for just a minute. Remember what was told there. Jehu, on the one hand, is God's instrument to take Ahab's house out of the way. But in chapter 10 and verse 30, the Lord said to Jehu, because you've done well in carrying out what's right in my eyes, done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. But where is Zechariah? He's generation number 4. We went from Jehu to Jehoahaz to Jeroboam to Zechariah. Okay, time to get that lineage out of there. So now we have Shallum. And we look at Shallum. How long does he reign? Boy, he's not quite the shortest, but he's in the running, a month. And he is assassinated by Menahem, as we sometimes pronounce it. But Menachem, same name as Menachem Begin, that used to be the president of Israel, the prime minister of modern Israel. Menachem sacks Tifsa, all who are in it, and its territory from Tirzah on, because they did not open it. And he sacked it. And what was his claim to fame? Well, he ripped open the bellies of the pregnant women there. He's extraordinarily brutal and violent. Destroys the unborn. If you flip over to Amos chapter 1 and verse 13, or Hosea chapter 13 verse 16, you find reference to that kind of behavior, and it's never a good thing. He is an evil king. Now, look down to verses 19 and 20 for just a minute. The Assyrians now come on the scene, and if you look at a map, and I see our map is gone. Let me pull out a map here. If you look at a map of Israel at that time and Syria, you'll notice that Assyria is basically to the north side of Syria. So we're getting farther away in one sense from the territory of Israel, and the influence of the foreign kings is coming from farther and farther away. Let me find the map that I'm looking for here, and I'll show you. Okay. Now this is actually a rather small map. I'll show you, and then I'll bring it over here. But as you look at this, I'm going to be real high tech here and just do it this way. Right here is Assyria, all up here. Syria would have been down in here, and then moving down farther, we get into Palestine, which is just this little circle of area here. So we're moving actually up into the regions of what would have been Eastern Turkey, and moving over toward Iran, Iraq, all that area right here up along almost to the Black Sea. So the invaders are coming from farther away. The Syrians, who are the next door neighbors, at this point basically are being absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. And it's the Assyrian Empire that is ultimately going to take control of all of Israel's territory and deport them as a captive people. So Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land. Menachem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to help him confirm his hold on the royal power. And so Menachem buys him off. Now Pul is the last king of Nineveh. And after him, the capital is going to be moved to Babylon. But it's not yet the Babylonian Empire. They're just going to move the capital there. You look down to 21:22, Menahem dies, slept with his fathers. The king of Assyria turned back, did not stay in the land, because he was bought off. Well, Menachem dies, and now we get Pekahiah. And Pekahiah now we have a son succeeding his father, but he's an evil man. He does what's evil, reigns 2 years, and he's assassinated by one of his own captains, according to verses 25 and 26. Pekah, the son of Remaliah, his captain, conspired against him with 50 men of the people of Gilead and struck him down in Samaria, in the citadel of the king's house, right there in the palace, basically. And they disposed of him. And so now what happens? Well, the guy that put the plot together and killed him becomes king. So now you've got Pekah, and he's no better. He's evil, same way. Now the Assyrians come back, and they don't really, the Israelites don't really have anything left with which to buy them off. This is the last year of Azariah's reign in Jerusalem, Uzziah. Pekah begins to reign. He's going to reign 20 years. And during his time, what happens? Well, the Assyrians come back, and Israel doesn't have anything left to buy them off with. So basically, they take the territory and the people of Naphtali into captivity. They begin to export captives. Pekah ends up being assassinated by Hoshea in verses 30 and 31. But notice, before we get there, in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser came and captured Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maacah and Janoah and Kadesh and Hazor and Gilead and Galilee and all the land of Naphtali. Tiglath-Pileser is important because we've gone from Hazael and Ben-Hadad in Syria to Pul in Assyria, and now Tiglath-Pileser. And Tiglath-Pileser is important because who's going to come knocking on the door of Jerusalem before long? It's going to be his dynasty threatening them in the days of Hezekiah. So we have Pekah, I'm sorry, I had a mental blank there for a second, who rules for 20 years, and now he's out of the way. He's taken out of the way by Hoshea. And Hoshea, there is an irony here in this man's name. Look at verses 30 and 31. Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, struck him down, put him to death, reigned in his place in the 20th year of Jotham, the son of Uzziah. And the rest of the acts of Pekah, they're written in the books of the Kings. And Hoshea is going to be the last king of Israel. But here's the irony. What does his name mean? We have several different variations of this name in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we are introduced first to Joshua, the son of Nun, who was one of the 12 spies, one of the 2 faithful spies in the days of Moses. Joshua, who becomes the general that leads Israel into the land of promise. And then we have the prophet among the minor prophets, Hosea. And then we have Oshea as well. And then we have this king, an unrighteous king, Hoshea. All of their names, Joshua, Hosea, Hoshea, Oshea, and in the New Testament, Jesus, all mean the same thing. They're all variations of the same name, which means Savior. Well, here's an irony. The last king of Israel has a name that means Savior, and yet he's no Savior. So this brings us to the reign of Jotham in Judah. Now, Jotham is the son of Uzziah, and Jotham has been co-regent with his father for some period of years. what we know about Jotham is he's a good king. Like his father and his grandfather and so on before him, he left the high places in place. But you jump over to 2 Chronicles 27 for a minute and notice in verses 5 and 6, the Amorites, who were neighbors to Judah, they're put under subjection. He gets these heathen people that are a thorn in the flesh and puts the quietus on them so that they're not a thorn in the flesh anymore at that point. It's at this point that Pekah, just before he's killed by Hoshea, and Rezin of Syria. So we've got a whole lot of politicking going on here. Rezin and Pekah joined forces to make war on Judah. Some of the kings in Israel seem to always have designs on Judah. And it's natural in some ways because they are related people. In those days, the Lord began to send Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, against Jerusalem. Well, why would he do that? It says the Lord did that. And if Jotham and Uzziah are basically good kings, why would the Lord allow that?
The same thing we've talked about before, consequences. The consequences don't go away.
Consequences don't go away.
And the son of Hezekiah, who burned his own children, was so bad that he's mentioned several times after his death as the reason that he was so bad that God said it's time. No more.
Mind you, we haven't even gotten to that yet, but we're headed that way. Notice as you go into chapter 16, what happens? Just before Hoshea acquires the throne of Samaria, of Israel, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, becomes the king in Jerusalem. And what do we discover about Ahaz? Well, you flip over to 2 Chronicles chapter 28, and the parallel account tells us the same thing we have here. He was an evil king who worshiped idols, including Molech. Now, who is Molech? Molech is one of the idols of the Canaanites. And the worship of Molech in particular was characterized by human sacrifice. So we read in chapter 28 in 2 Chronicles, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He made metal images for the Baals. He made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom and burned his sons as an offering. Now, where's the valley of Hinnom? That's not the Kidron Valley. It's the other valley. It's right there. Jerusalem overlooks the Kidron Valley to the east and the Hinnom Valley to the south. And in the days of Jesus in the New Testament, the Hinnom Valley has become the town dump. When Jesus talks about the place where the fire never goes out and the worm does not die, he's alluding to Gehenna, the Hinnom Valley, which was the city dump. They had to keep fires burning because there was always trash and dead animals and things like that there, that it was a sanitary thing in order to keep down contamination there. Well, why did the Hinnom Valley become the town dump? Remember what took place there. We have altars built for idolatry there, and a prophecy that a coming king, 300 years down the road from the time of the prophecy, 330 years, Josiah by name, would defile those altars and burn human bones on them, the bones of the false prophets, so that they could not be used as places of worship anymore. Well, here you have part of the reason that that place was considered a place of decay, a place of corruption, because what has Ahaz done there? He's worshipped idols, including Moloch. And it's here Rezin and Pekah attack Judah, but they don't prevail. Rezin does manage to conquer Elah or Elath in verse 6. And if you jump over to 2 Chronicles 28 again for just a moment, verses 9 through 15, Israel takes a lot of captives and a lot of spoils, a lot of loot. But now we're introduced to a prophet whose name is Obed. And along with some of the princes of Judah, he's able to get the captives released. But look what happens, 2 Chronicles 28, 17, 18, and 19. We go from being tormented by Israel and Rezin of Syria to being tormented by the Edomites and the Philistines. Well, wait a minute. Didn't Judah just conquer the Edomites a few years before? Absolutely. But here they came back. Is it any wonder then that there's so much friction and so much hatred between Judah and Edom in particular? I mean, they're neighbors, they're constantly rubbing up against each other, and they're constantly fighting. Look over to verses 7 and 8 here in chapter 16 of 2 Kings. And here, Ahaz winds up hiring Tiglath-Pileser to take his side. At verses 7 and 8, you look at verse 6, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elah for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath. And the Edomites came to Elath, where they dwell to this day. And so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Syria, of Assyria. I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. Ahaz also took the silver and gold found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house and sent a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him and marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin. What we have here is the beginning of the end for Israel. Israel is troubling Judah, but what does Judah's king do in response? He doesn't appeal to God. He makes the same mistake that an ancestor had made in a previous generation and buys off a heathen king to defend him. Well, that's going to come back to bite them before long, because what's going to happen in the next generation? Who succeeds Ahaz? Who is the son of Ahaz?
Hezekiah.
That's going to be Hezekiah. And it's in Hezekiah's day that the Assyrians are going to come back knocking on the door, and the Rabshakeh, the generalissimo basically of the Assyrian army, is going to stand out in front of the whole city, in front of all the people of Jerusalem, and say, what king, what God is there that has withstood us? You better just roll over for us. Here's a letter demanding your surrender. Well, in spite of his parentage, Hezekiah had better sense than his father. That's right. So King Ahaz goes to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser. Here's this ought to be fascinating in a way. Syria falls to Assyria. It's taken captive. Ahaz goes to meet Tiglath-Pileser. He saw the altar that was at Damascus. And what does he do? Think about the lunacy of this. What kind of altar is at Damascus? Damascus is the capital of the Assyrian Empire. These people are idolaters. And the king sends a diagram of it home so Uriah the priest can make a copy of it in Jerusalem. In essence, what King Ahaz is saying is the gods of Assyria gave us this victory. And so we're going to worship them. Notice what happens when he gets home. The king drew near when he came home from Damascus, drew near to the altar, went up on it, burned his burnt offering, his grain offering, poured his drink offering, threw the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. The bronze altar that was before the Lord, he removed from in front of the house, from the place between his altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of his altar. So he appropriated the Lord's altar for his idolatry. And King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, on the great altar burn the morning burnt offering and the evening grain offering and the king's offering and all of these things, and throw on it all the blood of the burnt offering. But the bronze altar shall be for me to inquire by. Uriah the priest did all this as King Ahaz commanded. And look what else he does. He then goes on to desecrate more of the furniture and so forth of the temple. And subjective religion, which is what this is, sets its own rules. He is changing things to suit himself, playing by his own rules. Alters the things that belong to the Lord. Notice, get down here to 2 Chronicles 28 and 24. And what does he do? He even closes the doors of the temple proper. He basically closes off the temple so that the people can't come and offer sacrifices there. So you read in verses 19 and 20 about the death of Ahaz. The rest of the acts that he did are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, and he died and was buried with his fathers, and Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his stead. And finally, Judah is going to begin, at least temporarily, to get back on track. So things are not quite as messed up as they were. But in the meantime, you go into chapter 17, and here is where Israel, the northern kingdom, is going to be done away. You have Hoshea, the king of Israel, the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah. Hoshea began to reign in Samaria. He reigned 9 years. He's evil, not like the ones before him. He's not as bad as some, but he's still evil. He's still an idolater. Shalmaneser now has succeeded Tiglath-Pileser as the king of Assyria, and he makes Hoshea just a vassal, a subject, a client king. Think of it as the relationship between the Soviet Union back in the day and East Germany or Bulgaria or Poland. The Soviet Union called the tune, and those satellite countries, they just clicked their heels and said, yes, sir. Well, that's what Hoshea is doing for Shalmaneser now. He is nothing more than a tribute king. But notice there's an interesting little problem here. Hoshea doesn't pay his taxes 1 year. He's trying to get the Egyptians to run interference for him, to buy him some time, buy him some slack. Sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria. as he had done. The Egyptians at this point are largely paper tigers and have been for generations and will become more so as time goes by. The thing that keeps the Egyptian pharaohs in power at this point is simply the fact that they're so far away from everybody else that there's nobody anywhere close to them that's more powerful than they are. And so on paper, they look like a mighty empire because they control a lot of territory in North Africa. But in reality, they don't have the wherewithal to stand up to anybody. And so they're no help to Hoshea. And so Shalmaneser puts him in prison and besieges the land. Here we're going to see Samaria and the territory of Israel basically emptied out of the Israelites and then repopulated. Hoshea is taken prisoner. This is the end of Israel as a nation. So you look at verses 7 through 18, and here we have 4 reasons laid out for why they are dissolved as a nation. And it's worth pointing out, they will never exist as an independent nation again. Now, they can be restored, but they'll only be restored as part of Judah after Babylonian captivity. But look at the sins that are listed here. Verses 7 through 12, they served false gods. They abandoned God and served false gods. How many people in our world today live their entire lives doing that? Some years ago, even modern atheism was acknowledged by courts of law as a form of religion. It's the religion of no God. How many people in our world live in service to false ideals, false gods, false concepts of God? Well, next you look at verses 13, 14. It's bad enough to live in ignorant worship of a false god. But these people were without excuse because they refused to hear the prophets that God sent to them. And think about who all God sent them. We have Elijah and Elisha. And we haven't even talked about Isaiah really, but Isaiah is in there too. And then verses 15 and 16, they rejected the laws, the statutes of the Lord. And notice the expression down here in verse 17. They burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. But notice what the next verse says. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. Jeremiah will talk about the difference between Israel and Judah, and he'll say, God divorced Israel and took on Judah. And instead of being faithful, Judah ends up behaving worse than Israel did. And the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel, afflicted them, gave them into the hand of plunderers until he cast them out of his sight. And when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Jeroboam drove Israel from following the Lord, made them commit great sin, and they walked in all the sins that Jeroboam did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. And so Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. Well, that's a good place to stop and take our break. And we started a little late, so we'll take a little bit shorter break, about 10, 12 minutes. And we'll pick up there at 10 past 8. Well, let's get started again. We had talked about the final end of the northern kingdom and the explanation that's given here in 2 Kings chapter 17 for why, the various reasons given. And so verse 18 says that God removed them out of his sight. And then we noticed that Judah, far from learning from their example and doing better, Judah learned from their example and did worse. And you notice in verses 20 through 23, the Lord runs out of patience and Israel is exiled entirely. But notice in verse 24, from verse 24 down to the end of the chapter, basically, you have the results of the captivity. And here, the results that we're talking about are basically material results, territorial results. You have captured peoples being moved to different places. And this was very common in the ancient world among the rising empires. The Syrians did it a little bit. The Assyrians, which is who we're dealing with now, were much more prone to relocate people. And the Babylonians do the same thing. It's not until we get to the Medo-Persians that we find things beginning to reverse course. But that's a couple of hundred years in the future from this point. The reason for the relocation, the deporting and resettling of conquered peoples, when you look at it from an idolatry point of view, it was very logical. Remember that God had given Israel victory over the Syrians in the days of Ben-Hadad because they were saying the God of Israel is a God of the hills and our God is a God of the plains. And in the days of Ahab, the Israelites had won over a vastly superior force. And so they come back the next year with exactly the same number of soldiers, the Syrians do, and generals in charge instead of the princes of Syria and so forth. And they draw Ahab and his army down onto the plains. And what happens? Well, they get whooped again because God is on the side of his people, even when they're ungodly people like Ahab. In the day of idolatry, the common belief among most idol-worshiping people was that the power of their particular God was tied to the territory where he was worshiped. And you remove these people from that territory, you remove the power of their God. That's the whole thing of bring them down out of the hills and we'll win on the plains. Well, of course, God showed that was not the case. But that was the common belief. And so when a heathen empire conquered a small kingdom like Israel, it was actually very common for them to deport the people to some other conquered land. Because number one, that disconnects them from their cultural and territorial heritage. Number two, it reinforces the idea that their God or gods don't have as much power as our gods to resist us. And therefore, when we move them over there and expose them to a different culture and different gods and different beliefs and so forth, what that will do is basically assimilate them into our culture and they'll become part of us. So here's what Shalmaneser does. He conquers Israel in the days of Hoshea and uproots the people and sends them north and east. And in the meantime, what's he going to do with the territory that he's conquered? Well, come down here to verse 24. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, from Cutha, from Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. So he takes all of the Israelites out and brings these foreigners in, and basically they effectively trade places. Well, at the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. And this is significant because of where this is going to go over time. They did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them that killed some of them. Skeptics today look at this and say, there are no lions in that part of the world, which is true in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. But the Asiatic lion, which is a smaller version of the traditional African lion, same animal, just about 80% of the size of an African lion, now found basically only in the Indian subcontinent. In ancient days, the Asiatic lion roamed all the way from China to the Mediterranean, and they were quite common in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, in those ancient times. And then they had other large cats, what we would typically call a mountain lion or a puma as well. There are a variety of different big cats that at one time were found there. But in the meantime, what's happened over the centuries, they've been hunted to extinction all through that territory. In fact, hunting of lions was a big thing for the kings of Babylon. Well, God sent lions among them, and some of them were killed. Notice the reason that's given. They did not know the law of the God of the land. Well, that's a funny way to put it. Who's the God of the land? That's God, the only God. He's the God of all the land. But in this case, this is his own special territory. And so they've got this problem. Okay, we need a priest. We need somebody that represents that God to go there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. Here's an interesting thought, an interesting conundrum. Who would we expect to find as priests among the people taken away from Samaria? Well, but remember in Ahab's day and on back, they had driven out the Levites. The Levites had largely migrated to Judah. We would expect then that this would be a priest of those golden calves. But apparently, as in Elijah's day, there are still a few faithful in the land of Israel, still a few faithful among those who are carried away into Assyrian captivity. God always has a remnant. So one of the priests came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should fear the Lord. Now, think about this for a moment. Where geographically is Bethel? If you look at a map of ancient Israel and Judah, Israel actually kind of surrounded Judah on three sides, because you have Reuben and Manasseh and Gad over here on the east side of the Jordan, and then you have the other part of Manasseh and Ephraim, where Samaria is located, and Issachar and Dan and Zebulun and Asher and so forth, all up here kind of in the north of the territory. But then around on the side and down below, what do you have down here? You've got Simeon down here to the south. And that's where Bethel was located. Dan, the city of Dan, way in the north. So when Jeroboam starts his religion, puts an altar at Dan and one at Bethel, he has bracketed Jerusalem basically, so that none of the people of the 10 tribes, in his way of thinking, have any excuse to go to Jerusalem. It's convenient, regardless of which altar you go to, it's convenient for everybody. So this priest comes and lives at Bethel. Well, where does that put him geographically? He's actually not far from Judah, actually not far from the presence of the people who are at least nominally supposed to be faithful to the Lord still. But notice what happens. In verses 29 through 34, every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the Samaritans had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived, they still persist in their own religion, their various idolatrous religions, just like the Israelites apparently persisted in their idolatry even in captivity. They feared the Lord, but they still served their own gods. You look at verse 33, they feared the Lord, but served their own gods after the manner of the nations from among whom they'd been carried away. So, to this day, they do according to the former manner. They do not fear the Lord. They do not follow the statutes or the rules or the law or the commandment of the Lord, that the Lord commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. And then he goes on and talks about what God had commanded Israel. We talk about what God expected from Israel, and you get down to verse 40, they would not listen. They did according to their former manner. And so you have mixed worship. They feared the Lord and also served their idols, their carved images. Their children did likewise, and their children's children, as their fathers did, so they do to this day. So you have these foreign people, Babylonians and others that have been relocated there. They take on just enough of the religion of Israel, in a sense, to placate God, shall we say, but they don't turn to him. Now, this is significant because who do these people end up, some of their descendants end up becoming?
Samaritans?
They wind up becoming the ancestors in large degree of the Samaritans. Now, after Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, we're going to find that during the intertestamental period, a lot of the idolatry that they had brought with them kind of dies out. And their worship, which is centered at Samaria, where is Samaria geographically? Samaria is in Israel, but when you look at the map, it's basically between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. What's significant about Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim? In the days of Joshua, they come into the land at Gilgal, they conquer Jericho, they conquer Ai, and then where do they go from there? Basically, they take the whole nation up to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and they put 6 tribes on this mountain and 6 tribes across the valley on that mountain. And these 6 tribes recite the blessings of God to these 6 tribes, and these 6 tribes recite the curses of God to these 6 tribes, back and forth to remind them of who and what they're supposed to be and whose they are and who they're supposed to honor. Well, it's not by accident that Jeroboam located his headquarters right there in between. And it's no accident then that these people who take on, who are not Israelites at all, but they take on just enough of the knowledge and the religion of Israel's proper God to, shall we say, get by. In that intertestamental period, they become, in some respects, the ancestors or the source of the people that we would see in the New Testament as Samaritans. But how do the restored Jews then interact with the Samaritans in the first century? In their world, in their thinking, the only creature on earth nastier and filthier and more unclean than an outright idol worshiping Gentile was a Samaritan. Because the Samaritans, in their estimation of things, are basically half-breeds. They have just enough of the religion of the true God to be dangerous. And it's interesting, the Samaritans of Jesus' day were despised by the Jews in part, here's you an irony, in part because their beliefs were a lot like the Sadducees in this respect. The main thing that separated the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that the Sadducees primarily, they didn't believe in a resurrection, but as far as the scriptures were concerned, the only part of the scriptures they really concerned themselves with were the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law, the Pentateuch. They didn't pay much attention to, they didn't put a lot of store by the prophets and the other inspired writings. They were focused on just the law. Well, the Samaritans were basically in the same place. They accepted the writings of Moses, what their ancestors would have been taught by this priest, but they rejected the prophets and the other inspired writings like Psalms and Proverbs and so forth. So, irony of ironies, the Samaritans and the Sadducees, in a sense, were on the same page, and yet the Sadducees and the Pharisees considered the Samaritans the absolute lowest form of life on earth. A really diligent, observant Pharisee in particular in Jesus' day, who had to travel from Judea to Galilee or Galilee to Judea, would actually not go straight north or straight south. They would go east and cross over the Jordan River and go through the territory called the Decapolis or Perea, which was basically Gentile-infested territory, until they got past Samaria, and then they would cross back over the Jordan west and come into Galilee or come into Judea, because they did not want the contaminated dust of Samaria on their feet. It's interesting that when Jesus is traveling back and forth, you see in John chapter 4, he just goes straight through Samaria, doesn't even hesitate. And think about the parable he tells of the man who fell among thieves. Who passed by that man? A priest who should have been the epitome of righteousness. And then a Levite who was a teacher in Israel. And who is it that helps the man? Has the milk of human kindness in his veins. A Samaritan, the person that they would have despised more than anybody. In fact, Jesus asks, all right, which one was neighbor to this man that fell among thieves? And the Pharisee, the scribe that answers him, can't even bring himself to say a Samaritan. He says the one that helped him. He can't even stand to admit it. So these people, they fear the Lord, but they still serve their own gods. And there's mixed worship by those who are moved in to Israel. Well, that takes us then, now that we're done with Israel, that takes us into the kingdom of Judah entirely at this point. And chapters 18 through 25, which basically is the rest of the book of 2 Kings, that's the history of the Jewish kingdom after the fall of Samaria. So it's Tiglath-Pileser is the Assyrian emperor who first interacts with Israel. And it's his son or his successor, Shalmaneser, that takes them into captivity. But in the meantime, in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, we're jumping backwards momentarily here, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. So his father is Ahaz, this unrighteous king in Judah. But here is a righteous man. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David, his father, had done. He removed the high places. He broke the pillars. He cut down the Asherah. He broke in pieces the bronze serpent. We'll get to the bronze serpent in just a second. But look what he does. He not only gets rid of the idolatry that his father had imported, but he gets rid of the high places where the people were worshiping God even, but not according to his law. There's a point to draw out here that God tolerated their corrupted worship of him. They offered sacrifices in the high places and so forth, gave offerings to the Lord in these various places. They created activities that looked a whole lot like the idolatry of the people around them. And God tolerated that. You don't ever find any explicit statement that says that God approved of it. And it's noted that this king or that king did not remove the high places, which implies what? He should have. Well, why did this go on for so long? What is it that Paul points out to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, about verse 30? The times of ignorance God overlooked, God winked at, King James Version says. But now he commands all men everywhere to repent. There was a time that God was willing to tolerate ignorance of some of these things by his people. But the fact that he did it then doesn't mean that we're free to do that now. And that's an important point to file away and remember. Just because God tolerated something doesn't mean that he approved of it. And just because he tolerated it does not set a precedent for us to follow in their footsteps and do what we want rather than what he's commanded. When God has given us instructions, that does not leave us free to do what we please. So,
Brother Dave.
Yes, ma'am.
The parable of the wheat and the tares.
Yes, that Jesus tells.
Also come into play here.
It might very well. In the parable of the wheat and the tares, you've got two different seeds, very similar, oversown together. You've got wheat planted and then tares, or darnel is usually what it's thought to be, oversown. And when they both come up, you've got plants that, until they bear grain, basically look alike. And if you go trying to tear out the tares, the darnel, you're going to uproot the wheat and ruin the whole crop. So what does Jesus say? Let them grow side by side until the harvest. And then you harvest the good grain and burn up the rest. Not everything can be easily, conveniently separated. And sometimes we have to live with the consequences until it can be put right. Well, here we have a man, Hezekiah, who is going to set a new standard that has not been seen in Judah basically since the days of David. And so he removes not just the idolatry, but even the incorrect worship of God. Notice it says he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Until those days, the people of Israel made offerings to it. This goes way back to before they were in the land of promise, when they were still wandering in the wilderness. And they moaned and complained and bellyached. And what did God do? He sent fiery serpents, poisonous snakes among them. And then Moses had to make this bronze serpent. By the way, this is commonly thought to be the imagery that is used for the medical profession now, the caduceus, the serpent twined around a staff, but or at least the root of that imagery. And then this bronze image of a serpent is put on a staff, raised up where it can be seen by all. And you get bit, you look at the serpent, you survive. You get bit, you don't look, you don't live. Well, lo and behold, what have they done with this thing? They've carried it, kept it all these years, and turned it into an idol. And what does Hezekiah call it? Nehushtan. It's just a piece of brass. That's what that word means. It's just a piece of brass. There's nothing magical or special about it now. It served its purpose. There's no need to keep it around any longer. So he broke it, disposed of it. Trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor those who were before him. So he set a standard that goes back all the way to Rehoboam, if not David. He set the high water mark. He's a good king. Flip over to 2 Chronicles 29, and here we find him calling on the Levites, verses 3 through 19. In the first year of his reign, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them, brought in the priests and the Levites, assembled them in the square on the east, and said to them, "Hear me, consecrate yourselves, consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, carry out the filth from the holy place." This is, when you think about this, this is astounding. In the days of Ahaz, things were so corrupted that the temple has been just closed up, used like a storeroom. And so they start cleaning up, straightening up. Our fathers have been unfaithful, done what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God, forsaken him, turned away, turned their backs, shut the doors, put out the lamps, not burned incense, not offered burnt offerings. That basically proper worship came to a screeching halt in the days of Ahaz. And then look what happens. They're going to find the book of the law. We'll get to that in a minute. But Hezekiah sets things in order. Jump down to chapter 29 in 2 Chronicles, down to verse 20. And in verses 20 through 26, once they get things cleaned up, get the doors open and get things halfway set right, now what are they ready to do? Now they're ready to start offering sin offerings, to start trying to make things right with God at this point. Hezekiah the king rose early, gathered the officials of the city, went up to the house of the Lord, brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats for a sin offering for the kingdom and the sanctuary and for Judah. The number 7 typically signifies completeness or totality. He made, in essence, he made a perfect sacrifice. He did the best he could. Commanded the priests to offer them on the altar of the Lord. They slaughtered the bulls and received the blood and threw it against the altar, and the rams and the lambs and the goats for a sin offering are brought to the king and the assembly, and they laid their hands on them. And then they slaughtered them and made a sin offering. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord, according to the commandment of David and of Gad, the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet. He started doing things right. He started restoring and fixing things. Come down to 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 31. You've consecrated yourselves to the Lord. He's speaking to the priests. Come near, bring sacrifices, thank offerings into the house of the Lord. The assembly brought sacrifices. The number of burnt offerings was 70 bulls, 100 rams, 200 lambs, 600 bulls, the consecrated offering, 3,000 sheep. And guess what? I haven't got enough priests. What a sorry state of affairs. They don't have enough priests to offer all the burnt offerings. So until other priests had consecrated themselves, the Levites helped out. And notice what it says about the Levites. The Levites were more upright in their heart than the priests in consecrating themselves. The non-priestly Levites had been more enthusiastic about setting things right than the actual priests had been. I wonder why. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. The priests are from the descendants of Aaron. His three sons, Gershom and Merari and Kohath, his descendants. But not all Levites are descended from Aaron and Moses. So you've got a situation where all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. And the Levites that are not priests, they teach and they serve the needs of the temple and so forth. And the priests actually do the sacrificing and what have you. But here, the priests that had actually consecrated themselves, that had made themselves right with God, there weren't enough of them. There were more Levites available than there were priests. How could it be that the Levites were more enthusiastic than the priests? A little speculation, but I think perhaps well-founded. When Ahaz closed the doors of the temple, stopped worship there, substituted false worship right there in Jerusalem, what did that do to the priests? Okay, they have no duties anymore because proper worship has come to a screeching halt. Well, what
also,
go ahead.
Also, it's mentioned maybe right in here, maybe with Joash, that the priests finally had enough to eat, because the sacrifices, that was where they got their food from.
There you go. It hit their bottom line because it took away their income, basically. It took away their food supply. So if they're going to be faithful to God, they're going to go hungry. What do some of them undoubtedly wind up doing? Undoubtedly, some of them go along with Ahaz because that way they eat well. So Ahaz dies, Hezekiah becomes king. Hezekiah sets about turning the whole world upside down, trying to straighten things out again. And what are some of these priests doing? They're waiting to see which way the wind's actually going to blow before they commit to doing what's right. So now that things are in motion, well, they've got to get themselves cleaned up and consecrated before they can serve. They've got to repent. They've got to rededicate themselves to what they should have been faithful to all along. And so the service of the house of the Lord ends up being restored, and Hezekiah and the people rejoiced because God had prepared for the people, and the thing came about suddenly. Some of these priests probably had whiplash at just how quickly things had turned around. And you come to chapter 30, and now Hezekiah invites everybody, Judah and Israel, to keep the Passover. Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord to keep the Passover to the Lord, the God of Israel. They had recognized we're not ready to do this. We've got to wait until the second month. We haven't got things in order yet. So That was permitted under the law. They couldn't keep it at the appropriate time. They didn't have the priests consecrated in sufficient numbers. And what happens? They send letters not just to Judah, but to whoever in Israel is still willing. And some responded. Some. Many scorned, but some responded. Verses 1 through 12. Notice what it says down here in verses 8 and 9. The words of the king's letter. Verse 7, do not be like your fathers and your brothers who were faithless, so that he made them a desolation. Do not be stiff-necked like your fathers. Yield yourselves to the Lord. If you return to the Lord, your brothers and your children will find compassion with their captors and return to this land. Because the Lord your God is gracious and merciful and will not turn away if you will return to him. The letters go all over the countryside, and some respond. You pick up at verse 13, and now the Lord accepts their efforts. Look down to verses 18 and 19. A majority of the people, many of them from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, had not cleansed themselves, yet they ate the Passover otherwise than as prescribed. Hezekiah had prayed for them, saying, may the good Lord pardon everyone who sets his heart to seek God, the Lord, the God of his fathers, even though not according to the sanctuary's rules of cleanness. And the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. So those who responded, God was willing to accept. And you go on down in verses 23 through 27, they keep another 7 days of celebration just out of rejoicing, basically, for the joy of the occasion. And then you come into chapter 31 and look at what happens. Hezekiah restores the law for offerings. And what do? There's huge abundance. You start at verse 2 in chapter 31 of 2nd Chronicles. It might help if I was reading chapter 32 instead of chapter 33. He planned in verse 2, when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem.
Where we are? We're in 2 Chronicles?
We're in 2nd Chronicles, and I said chapter 32. I read the wrong passage. It's chapter 31. Read the wrong note. Apologize for that. Hezekiah appointed the divisions of the priests and the Levites for burnt offerings and peace offerings and so forth. And what did they do? At verse 5, as soon as the command was spread abroad, the people gave in abundance first fruits of grain and brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. And the people of Israel and the people of Judah who lived in the cities of Judah. Now, look at this. The people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. What does that tell us about what had happened during the years of apostasy in the northern kingdom? Some of the people in those 10 tribes who wanted to be faithful to God had moved and were living in Judah. And they brought in the tithe of cattle and sheep and the dedicated things and laid them in heaps. And so they gave abundantly. They rejoiced. And Hezekiah's faith in the Lord is rewarded. Well, go back over to 2 Kings to chapter 18, and verses 9 through 12 give us a thumbnail sketch of what happened to Israel, sort of a repetition, a reminder. The 4th year of King Hezekiah was the 7th year of Hoshea. Shalmaneser came against Samaria and besieged it. At the end of 3 years, he took it. So it took him a while to to conquer the city. In the 6th year of Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, Samaria was taken. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria, put them in Hala and on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God. They neither listened nor obeyed. Well, that brings us then to a change of scenery, a change of guard, as it were, for the Assyrians, because now Sennacherib comes on the scene. Sennacherib is the successor to Shalmaneser, and he's the one who's going to come calling, as it were, to threaten Hezekiah. There's a parallel here to Isaiah chapters 36 and 37. Isaiah is, in some respects, the great counselor and encourager of Hezekiah, because now Isaiah is the dominant prophet of this era. Remember, though, Isaiah, though he is an encourager of Hezekiah, is also a prophet whose prophecies concern Israel. And a majority, or a large portion anyway, of his prophecies have to do with the conquest and the captivity and the end of nationhood for the northern kingdom. And pleading, always pleading for them to repent. So, down here in 2 Kings chapter 18, at verse 14, Hezekiah has now been on the throne for 14 years. He's firmly established. This is about the year, roughly speaking, about the year 701 BC or thereabouts. The northern kingdom has been in captivity for about 20 years. Bear in mind that the conquest and captivity does not all take place just in a matter of weeks or months. It's a process over a period of some years, and that's all of Hoshea's reign and then beyond that. And so in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, here comes Sennacherib against all the fortified cities of Judah, and he conquers the border cities, the fortified cities. And Hezekiah does something stupid. Sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish. And he says, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, whatever taxes you want to assess, I'll pay. He's putting his trust. This is not typical for Hezekiah, but it's political. It's a typical politician move. He puts his trust in riches and promises, and basically tries to buy Sennacherib off. I'll pay whatever you assess. Now, archaeological records from this time period confirm that Sennacherib conquered these fortified cities, and he took about 200,000 prisoners in doing that. So he has conquered some of the Jews at this time. The assessment is 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah basically empties out the palace and the temple treasury and strips the gold from the doors of the temple. And not smart. Not smart. And so now here comes the Assyrian army. And Sennacherib's message, look at verses 18 through 21. Don't trust in Egypt to save you. Well, there hasn't been any movement that direction, has there? But then on top of that, don't trust in your God either. Look at verse 22 down here. The message from Sennacherib via Tartan the Rabshakeh, Tartan the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh. These are the spokesman for the emperor. At verse 22, if you say we trust in the Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? In other words, what he's doing, he's trying to sow discord and trying to alienate the people from the king. Look what he's done. He's made a mockery of your worship. And of course, he has no frame of reference to understand that Hezekiah was actually restoring things and making them right. But he's trying to sow discord and uncertainty and doubt. And so there's a challenge in verses 23 and 24, pay tribute. Even if you had everything military that you could imagine at your disposal, you couldn't even defeat one of my weaker commanders. He's psychological warfare, basically. He's saying, you don't have any hope. Look at us. We're great. We're powerful. Look how many kings and how many gods we've overcome. You don't have any choice but to do what I say. And then look down here at verse 25. Sennacherib claims direction from Israel's God. Is it without the Lord that I have come up against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. Well, that makes him a false prophet. But in this moment, Hezekiah is going to grow a spine. His representatives, Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah, they asked, look, can we carry on this negotiation in the Assyrian language, in Aramaic? We understand it. Don't speak in Hebrew. And that's exactly what they're doing, speaking in Hebrew so everybody can understand and hear and be demoralized. Has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall who are doomed with you? And look at the imagery here. Doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own water. That's how bad it'll be if you fight back. There won't be anything left. Well, this is a good place to stop, actually, because that lets us next week pick up with Hezekiah's good and sensible and right response to the threatening of Sennacherib and his servants. So we'll stop here. Questions or thoughts or comments before we dismiss?
I was late. Have you mentioned the test?
I beg your pardon?
I'm sorry I was late. Did you mention anything about the test result?
I did not, but I have graded the tests that I received, and I will say that both of the students that returned tests to me made A's. And I will mail them to you so that you have the actual test. If I have your address, I believe I do. I think it was in the registration information.
Okay.
I will put that in the mail to you tomorrow.
Thank you.
You are very welcome, and you did very, very well. Any other questions or thoughts? If not, thank you for being here, both in person and online. Y'all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night, ladies.
Good night.